All right, so this is the lecture that I'm going to go ahead and record for next week. With the PSAT test and everything else we have going on, it's going to be kind of crazy. So I figured I better go ahead and plan to do this. This is actually going to it's going to have two parts to it, because the first section of this is fairly short. Primarily, I wanted to talk about this new concept of the people of the United States. The discussion board you had kind of asked you to think about what I talked about with, do we really want to trust government being in the hands of the masses? Remember that, actual representation was a huge deal for the colonists. And the idea was that those people that had a vote for the colonial legislatures were the ones that should make the decisions. Well, except, of course, we see that it leads to a bunch of chaos under the Articles of Confederation, when you have the states having so much power and that actual representation really kind of playing a role. So we see that the Constitutional Convention really kind of pushes out those kinds of individuals, and you kind of have a different society that is now in place, and a lot of this is going to have to do with this notion that these are people who have earned the right? They have been successful, they've made good choices, many of them have material wealth, and that they are hardworking individuals. This notion of what it means to be an American and the idea of individualism that is so incredibly important, right? A lot of these are very prosperous. They're merchants, that kind of thing. And, you're going to have some people that are, artisans or really work their way up from the bottom. But you're also going to have a healthy amount of people that inherit a degree of wealth, or at least inherit a degree of opportunity that maybe isn't accessible to everyone. So I want you to kind of understand that the new American, these men of the Revolution that had guided the country, these aren't necessarily everybody. This is one of kind of the dichotomies of American society, which is that, we talk a big game about democracy for everyone, and everyone having a say, and yet in practice, our society, especially in an economic sense, does not really function that way, where people have certain avenues open to them by matter of birth or education or social status, and that has always been true. Notice that one of the big characteristics here is that the role of the individual coming into play, and that it's the individual working hard, being able to prove themselves. That's very important. And you also have kind of a deeper ingraining of the notion of the individual voice, the vote, that I want to get to express my will. Americans are highly opinionated people, and we frequently have these ideas about what's best, and the individual should have a voice. And so these ideas are kind of floating around politically, that we should all have a say and that the individual is important, and yet we have a constitutional convention that really creates a system where the individual voice and the individual vote is diluted a little bit, because we don't quite trust it, not exactly, and we certainly have an economic system where it doesn't work quite the way with all this equality, right? That there's a little bit of an aristocracy of merit, but remember that this idea of merit and opportunity is often passed down, or a condition of social status. So there's a number of kind of conflicting notions going on here. I want to take a second to talk about the women of the Revolution, because I've kind of alluded to this periodically up to this point. And I had mentioned how important women were to the Revolution, whether it's the daughters of liberty, who helped kind of hold the fort down, keep everything functioning while the men were off fighting, whether they provided the home guard, whether they fought against Indians, whatever it was they were doing, the camp followers, the Molly Pitchers, those women that were so incredibly important to the success of the revolution, and they absolutely were. And yet, what we'll see is that women get pushed out of being able to participate in this new government anymore. That women in some states actually, states that had property requirements but didn't specify anything else, you had a handful of women that were able to vote. And yet, that right will be taken away. And I have a couple of statements here that you can take a second to read. I just want to kind of point out that these are different ideas, that you have women all over this new United States questioning, what about us? Are we going to get to vote? Are we going to get to have a say? Don't we have political opinions? I mean, they're listening to all this language that's being used about liberty and about, being able to formulate your own ideas and have a vote and all this kind of stuff. And they're starting to question whether or not they should be allowed in this. And so I have this copy right here of a letter from Abigail Adams to John Adams in March of 1776. Notice the part that I have bolded there. Much of this, of course, is kind of her writing to her husband and writing about the revolution. And of course, Abigail and John Adams have a unique relationship. But I do think that Abigail, and the previous quotes that you read, will tell you this, right? That women had a lot of different, ideas about what this new country would mean for them. And she goes on to say, do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, but such as you wish to be happy, willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. And so I think this is the famous Remember the Ladies quote, that women were calling for this right to participate. You also have, in a global context, you have Mary Wollstonecraft. Her daughter is Mary Shelley, who writes Frankenstein. But Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the earliest feminists who's called for laws to protect civil and political equality, education to promote social and economic equality, said that women should be able to fulfill their potential. And this notion about the rights of women happens on both sides of the Atlantic. Of course, remember that about this time you have the French Revolution. And women were highly important in the French Revolution. It was aristocratic women who had all these salons where these ideas of the Enlightenment and of the American Revolution could be discussed and bandied about. And so you need to kind of understand that that women are really kind of in this really kind of intellectual eye of the hurricane, so to speak, as far as, how do these things apply to us, and are we going to turn society on its head? What do we want? That kind of thing. And so I want to point that out because I think it's very telling, especially as we're looking at men and this question of who really got to have a say in government. Was it all men, or was it just men of a particular social class and a particular economic station? You've got questions about, blacks, and, is slavery something that should exist in this new country that's based on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And then, of course, this question of women. So I wanted to be sure and kind of address that because I think it makes you a more thinking individual. Remember that these women were very confident after the revolution, after dealing with these ideas. These are women that were central to the success of the colonial experience. But most men never really considered the women. None of the founding fathers really gave this any thought. I mean, I'm sure John Adams read that letter from his wife and said, "Oh, Abby, she's being so cute." He never really took that seriously. And I put down here, enter the prison of Republican motherhood. So they kind of silence this American female sense of what about us? Aren't we included in all of this? They silence this with the notion that women are supposed to teach the men, right? That women have to be, yes, women, you have to be educated, you have to be knowledgeable, you have to have political opinions, you have to have all these kinds of things, because a strong democratic republic, this representative system, requires these educated and aware voters, and women, you are the ones that are responsible for that. And so they kind of made this argument that, well, you don't need political rights because, well, you'll be able to express your political viewpoints through the men around you, through your father, through your brother, through your husband, through your son. And that would be enough, and that be satisfied with your education, right? So I do think that there's an interesting level where, on one hand, they give women this opportunity. Go be educated, go to college, do something, right? You can focus on social reform. You start to see women, especially kind of upper middle class, high class women, starting to engage in education and participate as teachers and that kind of thing. Women would also focus on community activities. A lot of the social reforms that start to take over in the early 1800s, some of which we'll touch on later, but abolition is a big one. You're going to have the women's movement, right? The Declaration of Sentiments in 1848. You're going to have the asylum movement, which was a major shift in the way they treated people who were mentally ill or treated prisoners. Was perceived as very, very reform-minded. Even the nature of education itself was designed to be something that was very different, where how you taught children. It wasn't just about we'll just leave it up to the parents. It was, we have to take responsibility for all children to be educated. And so women are very focused on that. And this new Republican motherhood says, yes, that is perfectly fine. But stop short of asking to participate in an election. We don't want you to be able to do that. We certainly don't want you to have a political position. And it's going to take until the early 1900s, late 1800s, as Western expansion and the Western territories get really desperate for voters. You'll see them extend to women a little bit the right to vote. But it's going to take another, 80 to 100 years, a little bit more certainly at the national level, before women get to really participate in this representative system. And a lot of it is based on this idea of Republican motherhood. And so I want to be sure that you kind of understand how that substitution takes place, and what this does to women overall, as far as leaving them kind of questioning, what was it all for? Is this right? And we'll certainly see that women will eventually, as the slavery issue, as, Western expansion and the cotton market, brings slavery into full focus as to just how horrible it is. Women will kind of make this decision that slavery is the bigger evil. And so we'll kind of talk about that a little bit as the farther we go along. And so the big question that you have to think was the revolution truly a revolution? If a revolution is about turning everything over and creating a completely new system, and if what you're talking about is that we had this system in the colonies of white property owners that controlled the political system, right? Is that really did we really have a revolution at all? I mean, arguably, they kicked out the king, they kicked out monarchy, they threw off the control of the British crown, and they do replace it with this notion of, you don't have to be born into a specific family, that there are opportunities where you can make something of yourself. And so that's not a complete falsehood. There are stories of that happening, of the individual merit and that kind of thing. Now, they're much harder. They happen far less often. There's a lot of, asterisks after that on those situations. But technically, they're correct, right? And so I do think that in that sense, you have a revolution. You have the throwing off of Europe. But at the same time, when you're talking about within what is now the United States, do we truly have a revolution? I would argue that the Articles of Confederation attempted a revolution, and that the Constitutional Convention said, whoa, wait a minute, we're going to put a stop to that. And what you essentially have is a system put back in place that allows these white male property owners to stay in power. And notice that they don't worry about anybody they perceive as inferior. And that does include women, Indians, and blacks, but it also includes males, white males that don't have property, white males who lack education, white males who live way far off on the frontier. Those men aren't considered as part of that infrastructure, right? We do see one thing in the fact that state-supported churches are completely abolished. This idea of the freedom of religion is very, very important in the United States, and I think it's very important, especially in these politically charged times, that we understand exactly what that means. That it truly does mean that there's no one religion, there's no one church that the government endorses over another. And yes, there are arguments to be made for some of the Judeo-Christian backgrounds of some of the founding fathers, but they never ever intended for religion to be defined by the government, ever. It was supposed to be defined by the individual and by the community. And so you have that being a major kind of change in the United States. And so one of the questions you should kind of stick in the back of your head was, how was it or how was it not a revolution? Especially as you get to things like the SAT test, when it's going to likely to talk about these issues of the founding documents. I mean, that could be something that you might consider. Other aspects of American society at the beginning of the 19th century, although remember the 19th century is kind of perceived as the long century, depending on your criteria. Some people even date the 19th century as starting as early as 1789 with the Constitution of the United States. Certainly it begins in 1800. And what you see is a huge population boom. Women are having lots of babies. The conditions in the United States tend to be healthier than what you have in Europe. You have a lot of young people. Half of Americans are under 16 by the 1790s. And these are very rural areas. There's all this territory that we have going from the East Coast all the way to the Mississippi River. Allows for these spread out places, these rural areas. You have all these family farms, and most of the culture is focused on these small rural little areas, these regional things that are far off. This idea of a national identity, of a national culture, really doesn't exist at the beginning of the 19th century because it's so fractured into these small rural communities. You have some kind of national culture, I suppose, in the sense of some of the big cities on the East Coast, and you have authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne and later, Edgar Allan Poe. So you start to have the emergence of some literature and some art forms that kind of take a leap from the European / English notions of culture. So you do start to have a gradual emergence into an American culture, but it's still, like I said, it's very fractured because of the emphasis on the small towns. Most Americans are not in this commercial agriculture at the beginning of the 1800s. This is incredibly important, especially as we're reading Northup. And remember that in the early 1800s, before the cotton gin and as the cotton gin's just becoming a thing, you have some commercial agriculture in sugar and rice, but a lot of what's happening at the farm level is going to be based on subsistence. And you're going to have lots of farmers who are basically just growing enough for their families and a little bit extra. And you're going to have, you'll have a few, like in the Ohio River Valley, that are focusing on wheat. But as we'll talk about in the next lecture, they end up using a lot of that, for whiskey, because whiskey's easier to transport down the Mississippi River than trying to take wheat, overland. So you're going to see that there's a lot of independence happening. Cities will focus on this idea of commercialism. And transportation is going to be an increasing issue going on here. And that the family farm is incredibly important. The yeoman farmer, and of course women, as we've talked before, in these small family farms are going to have far more power than what you're going to see with a large kind of commercial system. And so Thomas Jefferson will be a huge fan of the yeoman farmer and believe that this is the future for the country, except of course commercial interests will begin to weigh in on the success of the family farm, this trading and all this kind of stuff. Now, many of these people that were focused on subsistence farming are very nervous and very paranoid about too much government control. So we'll talk periodically about maybe kind of this disconnect between what people in commercial interests, in business interests, in politics, people that are running the country, how they perceive issues and how people on the frontier perceive issues. As long as the country's growing and everyone's generally doing okay, those questions about how much government's too much government and do we really want this strong central government, those questions won't really be overwhelming. They'll just kind of be murmurings in the background. But what we'll see is that by 1820, thanks to some economic panics and that kind of thing, that will change significantly. And remember that for Indians, they are largely ignored. We have the initial system set up with the United States where basically the government's in charge of kind of treatying with them. But you're going to see that most people don't pay any attention, especially as they start to resolve some of the boundary issues with European powers. And notice the end of the international slave trade. Remember that one of the key details in the great compromise that Benjamin Franklin puts forward is that you would have the end of the international slave trade in 1808. And so what that's essentially going to do, while on one hand that might seem like a progressive thing to do, we're going to end the international slave trade, they do nothing to resolve internal slave trade. And in fact, the situation that Northup finds himself in is largely responsible to the increased demand of internal slaves within the United States. And so that becomes a really, really huge thing. And like I said, it makes it more of a peculiar institution, makes slavery in the United States even stronger as far as the way that it functions and the way it kind of extracts labor from people. So yes, that is very, very true. Global context, remember that the French Revolution begins in 1789, right as the United States is essentially going back to its kind of creating stability in its own system. And this is largely because of debt from assisting the United States has become a problem. The French Revolution is a very radical interpretation of republicanism that really kind of goes wheels off in many ways. I mean, they go from, basically everyone can have a vote and women playing this huge role to all of a sudden you're having all these conflicts, all these various factions happening within this Republican system in France. You're having mass executions, the guillotine, and executing King Louis and Marie Antoinette, and very, very radical interpretation of what democracy and republicanism and representation should be. And of course that will eventually come full circle and be replaced by the emergence of Napoleon, who will then, of course, essentially do away with the notion of republicanism. So the French Revolution in many ways is a true revolution, and then it goes 360 degrees from a monarchy to basically an empire with an emperor. And so you're going to see that's kind of simmering in the background. That will have a variety of influences on the early American development. One compelling question is what prevents the United States from going down that path, from fracturing into a million little pieces. And if you remember from the Crisis and Confederation interactive game, that was one of the notions that they kind of threw out there. And what checks the United States is the fact that we put a system of government in place where the whims of the common man, the whims of people, are somewhat kind of pushed to the side. And they're at least diluted in the sense that, there's a stronger base that kind of steers the wheel of government. And so perhaps that's part of it. So we should remember that when we get frustrated with the system of government that we have and the things they do that we don't like, that one of the reasons our system is what it is because it's meant to check that. Now, obviously, there's some significant problems that existed then as now with people who have a lot of money having undue influence. And the fact that you have individuals that kind of exist in the middle social classes that sometimes, we're the drivers of much of what is strong about American economics, much of what's strong about American politics, and yet many times the concerns that really drive the middle are not listened to. And that was true in 1800 as well as being true in 2015. And so the United States system, while it does kind of prevent radical republicanism, is not always, it isn't perfect either, right? And so I just think it's really interesting to point that out, especially because we're in a period where you have a number of representatives in the House of Representatives who are incredibly radical in their interpretation of republicanism and what representation is and what government should be. And in many ways, they stall out our political system. And yet, they're not supposed to, according to our system. So it'll be interesting to kind of watch and see how politics begins to play out over the next 4 to 8 years and see what happens with these more populist elements. So that's pretty much it for kind of this new American society. I think I am going to stop this one and kind of and have this be a standalone lecture, and then the other one will be secondary. You will probably have to do both this week, just because we'll have to stay on target. Alrighty, thank you guys.